March 7, 1945. The Rhine River town of Remagen. Dawn breaks cold and pale over a landscape that no longer resembles anything human hands once built. The air tastes of cordite and wet stone. Through the morning mist, German soldiers peer from concealed positions along the eastern bank, watching the skeletal remains of what had been, just weeks before, a thriving industrial center. The bridge, the Ludendorff Bridge, still stands improbably, a lone crossing over dark waters that have swallowed every other span for miles. Across those twisted rails and battered planks, the Americans are coming. But it is not the crossing itself that will shatter German understanding of modern war. It is what comes after. It is what rises from nothing in the space between one sunset and the next dawn. The German defenders have been trained to understand war as a test of will, a crucible where the strongest ideology prevails through discipline and sacrifice. They have been told for years that their enemies are soft, corrupted by democracy and excess, incapable of the focused brutality that total war demands. The Bolsheviks, they were taught, fight like animals. The British cling to their fading empire with aristocratic delusion. And the Americans are children playing at soldier, propped up by industrial wealth they did not earn and cannot properly wield. This is what the Wehrmacht believed as they fell back across the Rhine, destroying every bridge behind them, preparing for the final defense of the fatherland. They expected the Americans to arrive slowly, cautiously, hampered by supply lines stretched across France, slowed by the methodical planning that characterized the Anglo-American way of war. They expected time to regroup, to fortify, to make every river crossing a bloodbath that would buy weeks or months for some miraculous reversal of fortune. What they witnessed instead would haunt their understanding of the war's outcome for the rest of their lives. The first American units crossed the Ludendorff Bridge on March 7th in a desperate rush, knowing the Germans have wired it for demolition, knowing it could drop into the Rhine at any moment. Engineers sprint across under fire, cutting cables, diffusing charges, working with the frantic precision of men who know that this single intact bridge could end the war months early. By nightfall, the 9th Armored Division has established a fragile bridgehead on the eastern bank. German commanders order immediate counterattacks. Luftwaffe bombers, grounded for weeks by fuel shortages, somehow scrape together enough aviation gasoline for strike missions. Artillery concentrates every available gun on the bridge approaches. For 3 days, the battle rages with the focused intensity of men fighting for the final stakes. The bridge itself, never designed to bear the weight of modern armor and battered by years of air raids, shudders, and groans with each crossing. On March 17th, after 14,000 American vehicles have crossed, after more troops have poured over in 10 days than crossed in the entire Normandy invasion's first week, the Ludendorff Bridge finally collapses into the Rhine with a sound, like the end of something ancient and irreplaceable. But by then it no longer matters. German reconnaissance patrols, probing back toward the river at night, report something impossible. The Americans have not merely held the bridgehead. They have not simply dug in and waited for reinforcements to trickle across on makeshift ferries and pontoon bridges. In the space of 72 hours, the United States Army has constructed what looks like a functioning industrial city on the eastern bank of the Rhine, where there had been rubble and ruins, where every building stood gutted by shellfire and every road cratered by demolition. There now exists a sprawling complex of tents, prefabricated structures, supply depots, vehicle parks, field hospitals, communication centers, repair facilities, fuel dumps, ammunition stores, field kitchens, water purification stations, electrical generators, and, most impossibly, paved roads connecting it all in a grid pattern that would make a city planner weep with envy. The reports filter up through the German chain of command and are dismissed as exaggeration, as the confusion of exhausted men seeing phantoms in the darkness. Oberst Heinrich von Einem, commanding what remains of the 89th Infantry Division, reads the intelligence summaries with growing anger. He has been fighting since Poland, has witnessed the slow grinding collapse of the Wehrmacht from the Volga to the Rhine, and he will not tolerate his reconnaissance officers inventing American superpowers to excuse their own failures. He orders aerial reconnaissance. The Luftwaffe, by now little more than a memory with wings, manages to send up a single Focke-Wulf 190 just before dawn on March 20th. The pilot returns shaking, unable to articulate what he has photographed. The images, developed in a bunker darkroom 40 miles east, show something that looks less like a military installation and more like someone has transplanted a functioning American town into the German countryside overnight. This is when the understanding begins to shift, when the ideological certainty starts to crack. The German military tradition, stretching back through Prussia to Frederick the Great, had always emphasized the primacy of will and discipline over material resources. An army won through superior training, better tactics, the moral strength to endure hardship that would break lesser forces. The early years of the war seemed to confirm this worldview. The Wehrmacht had conquered Poland in weeks, France in 40 days, driven to the gates of Moscow and Leningrad, with forces that were, on paper, numerically inferior but vastly superior in training and aggressive spirit. When the United States entered the war, German commanders analyzed their new opponent with a mixture of contempt and calculation. Yes, American industry was formidable. Yes, their productive capacity dwarfed Germany's. But industry alone could not win wars. The Americans would learn, as the French had learned, as the British were learning, that material wealth was meaningless without the warrior spirit to wield it effectively. Now, standing in the ruins of Remagen's eastern approaches, watching through binoculars as American engineers work under floodlights that turn night into day, German officers begin to understand that they have fundamentally misunderstood what kind of war they are fighting. The Americans are not simply well supplied. They are operating under an entirely different conception of what warfare can be. They have industrialized not just the production of weapons, but the entire process of military logistics itself. What the Germans witness at Remagen is not a supply depot or a forward operating base. It is a demonstration of a military philosophy that treats the battlefield as a construction site and approaches war with the same methodical efficiency that built the Hoover Dam and the Empire State Building. Every element of the American bridgehead has been prefabricated, tested, broken down into components that can be transported, then reassembled with standardized procedures that require minimal specialized knowledge. The roads are not hastily cleared paths. They are prefabricated steel matting called Marston mat, interlocking panels that can be laid down by work crews at a rate of thousands of square feet per hour, creating surfaces that can bear the weight of the heaviest tanks. The bridges replacing the collapsed Ludendorff are not jury-rigged ferries. They are Bailey bridges, modular steel structures that combat engineers can assemble in sections, floating them into position and anchoring them. With a speed that seems to violate the laws of physics and logistics, Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, an engineering officer who had helped construct the Atlantic Wall fortifications and considered himself expert in military construction, watches American bridge builders work and feels something close to despair. His own engineers, highly trained, men with years of experience, would need weeks to construct a single crossing capable of bearing heavy traffic. The Americans are completing 3 bridges simultaneously, working in shifts around the clock, and they are not elite engineer battalions, but regular combat engineers supplemented by what appear to be ordinary infantry, trained in basic construction procedures. They work with an efficiency that suggests practice, endless repetition, a system that has been refined through iteration until every movement is optimized. Weber observes through field glasses as a crane lifts a bridge section into place. The crane itself is something he has never seen before, a mobile vehicle-mounted crane that arrived disassembled on trucks and was erected in under 2 hours. The bridge section weighs tons. The Americans position it within inches of perfect alignment on the first attempt. The workers below signal, the crane operator responds, and the section settles into place with the precision of watchmaking. By April 1945, as American forces expand from the Remagen bridgehead and drive deep into Germany, the evidence of systematic organizational superiority is everywhere. German cities that have been bombed to rubble remain rubble, their populations struggling to clear streets by hand, to restore basic services through improvisation and desperation. American forces encounter destroyed towns and, where operational necessity dictates, reconstruct them within days. They bring forward portable generators to restore electricity. They repair water systems with prefabricated parts. They establish food distribution points supplied by trucks that arrive with metronomic regularity. They do not do this from humanitarian concern, but from operational efficiency. Functioning civilian infrastructure reduces security problems, prevents disease. Outbreaks frees military resources for combat operations. The Americans have calculated that the costs of reconstruction are lower than the costs of managing a completely collapsed society. The Americans themselves, for the most part, did not consider Remagen remarkable. It was simply good logistics, proper planning, the application of industrial methodology to military problems. They had practiced these techniques in North Africa, in Sicily, in Italy, in France. They had refined procedures through iteration, identified inefficiencies, standardized approaches. Remagen was not exceptional. It was typical of American operations in the European theater. This inability to recognize their own achievement as extraordinary is itself revealing. The Americans had so thoroughly industrialized warfare that rapid construction and reliable logistics had become routine. They expected roads to be built quickly, bridges to be erected efficiently, supplies to arrive on schedule. This was normal. This was how things should work. The contrast between American expectation and German experience defines the psychological gulf the war created. Germany had mobilized totally, demanded complete sacrifice, organized society around military necessity, and still could not match American output or efficiency. The United States had fought a two-front war, maintained domestic prosperity, produced surplus sufficient to supply Allied armies, and done it all while complaining about rationing and shortages that would have seemed like abundance to any German civilian. The scales were never balanced. The contest was never close. The outcome was determined not on battlefields but in factories, on assembly lines, in logistics centers, in the organizational structures that moved resources from production to consumption, with systematic efficiency. Remagen stands as the visible proof of this imbalance, the moment when American organizational supremacy was demonstrated so clearly that even true believers could no longer deny it. The city that rose overnight was not a miracle. It was procedure, practiced and refined and executed with professional competence. But to the Germans who witnessed it, who had been taught that willpower and ideology would triumph over material weakness, it might as well have been sorcery. They had lost the war years before, on assembly lines in Detroit and Kansas City, in planning offices where logistics were calculated and standardized, in factories that produced the tools and materials that made rapid construction possible. But they learned they had lost it watching the Americans build a city from ruins faster than German forces could destroy one. The lesson extends beyond the immediate tactical situation. Remagen becomes in historical memory a symbol of the democratic advantage in total war. Authoritarian systems can mobilize completely, can demand absolute sacrifice, can organize society around singular purpose. But democratic capitalism, with its diffuse decision-making and market mechanisms and voluntary cooperation, proves more efficient at resource allocation. The United States did not need to enslave its population or extract resources through conquest. It produced abundance through voluntary cooperation, market incentives, organizational efficiency. The K-ration was not the product of forced labor. It was the product of government contracts and factory workers paid competitive wages, and supply chain managers optimizing delivery routes. The city at Remagen was not built by slaves. It was built by combat engineers and civilian contractors and military personnel who were trained, paid, and motivated through normal institutional mechanisms. This is the final transformation, the ultimate shock to German ideology, the discovery that freedom and abundance are not incompatible, that democracy is not weakness, that material comfort does not produce decadence but rather the organizational capacity to wage war with overwhelming efficiency. The Americans brought their whole society to war, not through totalitarian mobilization but through systematic application of civilian organizational methods to military problems. They approached war the way they approached building skyscrapers or manufacturing automobiles, and the result was crushing, undeniable victory. The Rhine flows past Remagen still, dark water moving toward the sea, indifferent to the history enacted on its banks. The bridge is gone, the temporary city is gone, the soldiers who fought there are mostly gone, but the lesson remains, written into history with a clarity that no revisionism can obscure. Power in the modern age is not simply military or economic or ideological, it is organizational. It is the capacity to move resources from production, to use with minimal friction, to solve problems systematically, to industrialize not just manufacturing but the entire apparatus of governance and warfare. The nation that masters logistics masters war. The society that produces abundance produces power, and the ideology that cannot compete economically cannot ultimately triumph militarily, no matter how fervently its adherents believe. At Remagen, in March 1945, as American engineers laid steel matting and assembled Bailey bridges and erected a functioning city from prefabricated components, German soldiers watched and understood that they were witnessing not just a military operation, but a fundamental truth about the nature of power in the industrial age. The future would belong to those who could organize abundance, who could systematize efficiency, who could industrialize the mundane logistics of moving material through space and time. The future would not be decided by ideology or racial destiny, or warrior spirit. It would be decided by production schedules, supply chain efficiency, organizational methodology. The future would belong to those who could build cities overnight from ruins, who could turn waste into standard procedure, who could make abundance so routine that soldiers complained about the monotony of their rations while those rations represented luxuries their enemies had not seen in years. This was the lesson of Remagen, written in prefabricated steel and paved roads and bridge sections assembled with industrial precision. Not that might makes right, but that organization produces might. Not that ideology doesn't matter, but that resources matter more. Not that warfare has become mechanical, but that the mechanics of warfare, the logistics, the supply lines, the systematic movement of material, are warfare itself. The battles are decided before the first shot is fired, determined by productive capacity and organizational efficiency. The rest is epilogue, the working out of conclusions already written in factory output and logistics planning. The Germans came to understand this too late to matter, watching Americans build at speeds that seemed impossible, witnessing abundance that mocked years of sacrifice and hardship. They learned that they had lost the war not on the Eastern Front or at Normandy, or in the skies over their cities, but in the quiet accumulation of organizational advantages, in the systematic optimization of processes, in the patient construction of supply networks and production systems that could deliver overwhelming material superiority to every point of contact. They learned that warfare in the industrial age is fundamentally logistical, and logistics fundamentally organizational, and organization the ultimate expression of a society's capacity to coordinate voluntary cooperation toward common purpose. Remagen. This truth rose from ruins overnight, visible and undeniable. A city of abundance built on the graves of ideology, testament to the power of systematic efficiency over passionate belief. The bridge collapsed, but the lesson endures, that in the end, freedom produced victory not through moral superiority, but through organizational supremacy, and abundance proved more powerful than any ideology that denies its possibility. This is what the Germans learned, watching the Americans build. This is what history remembers, when the rhetoric fades and only the evidence remains. Power flows not from belief but from capacity, not from will but from systems, not from sacrifice but from the organizational genius that makes sacrifice unnecessary. The city that rose overnight was not miracle, but methodology, and methodology in the end won the war.